Hi, I'm Susan Colley, and welcome to your Disability Connection. The Americans with Disabilities Act contains information that protects those with disabilities from discrimination. Here to discuss this subject is Stacy Hart, ADA trainer, information and outreach specialist at the New England ADA Center, a project of the Institute for Human-Centered Design. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
Yeah. Stacy, what is and why is the Americans with Disability, why was it created?
The Americans with Disabilities Act is a civil rights law that protects people with disabilities from discrimination and making sure that people with disabilities are included in everything from school, work, because before we had the ADA, people with disabilities were discriminated against and often institutionalized.
Wow.
As part of the ADA, the Department of Justice realized that the ADA was quite complicated and created 10 regional ADA centers to help explain and guide people in the implementation of the ADA. The New England ADA Center is one of those ADA centers. So you can give us a call and I'd be happy to answer all of your questions.
Now, what is the definition of disability according to the ADA?
Sure. Every federal government has its own definition of disability. The Americans with Disabilities Act has a three-part definition. The first part is a person is a person with a disability if they have an impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. That sounds more complicated than it actually is. It just means that they have an impairment that affects them in comparison to the average person. Whether it be sensory, like someone who is hard of hearing,
Right.
Someone who has a physical disability, so
Right.
they have difficulty walking or breathing, or someone with a brain-based disability, such as learning or memory. That's the first part. The second part is someone who has a record of an impairment, so someone who is in remission from cancer, someone who is in recovery from the illegal use of drugs, or someone who had accommodations while in school. That's the second part of the definition.
I didn't know cancer was part of it.
Sure. Cancer in and of itself is a disability, but then sometimes you have follow-up medical appointments and you're in remission, so you still may need accommodations in order to attend those doctor's appointments.
Okay.
And then the third part is someone who is treated as if they have a disability. So someone who is regarded as a person with a disability whether or not they do. So someone with facial scars who applies for a job at a restaurant who is denied employment because it might scare the customers. Or someone who is assumed to have HIV because of the known status of a family member. That's the third part. So there are three parts of the definition of disability.
Wow. I didn't realize that it was that broad.
Yes, and that was really the point. The Department of Justice didn't want people trying to figure out whether or not someone had a disability. They wanted us to move past that to making sure that people could participate.
Okay. Now, who qualifies as an individual with a disability and who doesn't?
Well, that's kind of why we have the three-part definition.
Right.
There's no complete list of disability because Congress and lawyers who naturally develop laws would have left a disability out, and then someone would have been going down the list and saying, oh, you're not on the list, so you obviously don't have a disability.
Right.
And that really wasn't the point. So if people have questions about the definition of disability or whether they have a disability, they can call the ADA Center. For example, we get this question all the time. I don't have, I'm not in a wheelchair, but I have ADHD. Am I a person with a disability? Yes, you most certainly could be.
Right, because it's a developmental disability.
It's a
So-
brain-based disability, yes.
Right. Okay. Now, what are the goals of the ADA?
Sure. The goals of the ADA are to make sure that people with disabilities are included, that they can go to work, go to school, go grocery shopping, live in their communities, and be active members. The goal is to ensure that people with disabilities can participate in programs, services, and activities.
Okay. Now, regarding employment,
Sure.
what is an employer's responsibility to hire an applicant with a disability?
Okay. People with disabilities have the right to apply and interview for jobs just like everybody else. They can also ask for reasonable accommodations if they need to in order to apply or interview for a job, or then eventually to do the job. They have to be qualified for the job first. They have to have the experience and or the education necessary in order to do the job, and be able to do the job with or without accommodations.
Now, what is it? Can you explain what reasonable accommodations is?
Sure, I can try. So a reasonable accommodation is a change or modification in some aspect of the employment process so that a person with a disability can participate. Again, they have to be qualified, but it's a change or modification in how things are normally done.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Now, does an applicant have to reveal, this is a question that I'm sure a lot of people want to know about.
Sure.
Does an applicant have to reveal his or her disability when applying for a job or during an interview?
No, an applicant does not have to disclose that they have a disability in order to be hired for a job. We do get that question all the time. They feel like it's lying because they're not disclosing a disability, but sometimes an employee never discloses that they have a disability. Really, the only reason to disclose a disability is if the person needs a reasonable accommodation in order to do the job.
Right.
And at that point, if you know that you need an accommodation, we recommend that you disclose sooner rather than later.
Right. Before getting hired.
Well, not necessarily before getting hired, but before getting fired.
Oh.
So
Okay.
we get this question all the time, similar to, I didn't disclose when I was hired for the job, can I disclose now? You can disclose at any time during your employment with a company, but people often wait until they're fired in order, or on a employee performance improvement plan before they disclose. And if you wait until you're fired and you say, but wait, I have a disability, that's too late.
Okay. Okay.
I don't know if that made any sense.
Oh, that makes plenty of sense.
So yes, you don't have to disclose, but if you need a reasonable accommodation, you have to disclose a disability before asking for a reasonable accommodation.
Okay. Okay. What types of accommodations, reasonable accommodations, are you talking about? Like, in doing a job, like not being able to type, not being able to do stuff like that?
Well, it really depends on the nature of the company and the needs of the individual with a disability. It's that nexus. But yes, it could be voice-to-text software if you have difficulty typing. But you could have a glare screen for your computer. You could have Zoom text. There's all sorts of accommodations, and most of them are inexpensive.
Okay. What happens when it gets too costly for the employer?
Well, the employer has to go through this analysis before saying, nope, that's too expensive, we can't do it. They need to look at their finances, and not just for one branch, but for the company as a whole before they determine whether or not it's an undue hardship. So they need to go through that financial analysis, and they do need to spend some money on accommodations.
Okay.
If there's more than one accommodation that would be effective, then they can provide the accommodation of their choice.
Okay. Now, is drug testing admissible if it is a policy of being hired by an employer?
So is it allowed?
Is it admissible in when they, if they find out that they have drugs in their system?
So drug testing is a complicated topic. So it depends. The ADA and state law differ on whether or not you can drug test your applicants or employees, and the ADA treats the legal use of drugs and the illegal use of drugs differently. So per the ADA, employers can test for the illegal use of drugs at any time, so they can test for heroin or cocaine anytime. But they can only perform medical exams that could uncover the legal use of drugs during certain times. They can test once an applicant has been offered a job, but before they start the job, as long as everybody in a similar position is undergoing
The
drug.
same.
Yes, exactly. And then the only other time they can test once the person starts is if they're acting differently or they're acting high, and then it becomes business necessity. At that point, they could test for drug use.
Okay. Now, transportation. What is needed in a public entity like buses, subways, trains to comply with ADA standards?
Sure, that's also complicated, but a rule of thumb, if a public entity provides public transportation, it needs to be accessible and usable by a person with a disability.
Okay, now what specifically does there need to be, like ramps and verbal prompts and stuff like that? Is that what we're talking about?
So there would need to be either ramps or lifts because sometimes there's a gap for older trains and systems. If there is audio, there needs to be a visual indication of bus 43 or the green line now approaching 3 minutes away.
Right,
so
right.
there needs to be audio and visual.
Okay.
So yes.
And there has to be obviously some kind of ramps to get in and out of the trains and the buses and such.
Yeah, lift or those lifts or a ramp that comes out, sure.
Now, what about paratransit? Like, how does the ride meet transportation qualifications? And what about Uber and Lyft? Are they being watched?
That's okay. So let's take first things first. Paratransit. If there is public transportation being offered, then there needs to be paratransit offered within 3/4 of a mile of that public transportation. This doesn't include, so this is bus, subway. This does not include commuter rail.
Okay.
There have been lawsuits around taxis being inaccessible, but then we have Uber and Lyft. So that's still an evolving situation.
So right now they don't have to abide by ADA.
I didn't say that.
Oh.
I'm just saying that the courts are still addressing the issues. So we have this law, and it doesn't, not everything is prescribed within that law, especially since the ADA is nearly 30 years old. So
True.
the way we work that out is in the court system.
Okay.
Whether the Department of Justice enters into settlement agreements like they did with New York taxi drivers, or there's court cases. So Lyft and Uber is an evolving situation. Similarly, websites are an evolving situation.
Okay. Now, who do you complain to when an individual with a disability feels that they are being discriminated against?
Sure, it depends on the type of discrimination. So if it's employment, the person can file a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. If it's the police department or another state or local government entity, then they can file directly with the Department of Justice. If it's education related, they can file with the U.S. Department of Education. If it's housing related, that's the Fair Housing Act, and they can file with the Housing and Urban Development, and they can always file under state non-discrimination law. Here in Massachusetts, that's the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. That's the agency that enforces the state's non-discrimination law.
Okay, and is there anywhere in the Americans with Disabilities Act to also make a complaint?
Well, so that's a good question, and I'm sorry I didn't explain that well. So the Americans with Disabilities Act is enforced by the Department of Justice.
Okay.
So I gave the example of police department or any state or local government entity that they feel like they've been discriminated against, they can file with the Department of Justice. And really they can always file with the Department of Justice, but if that's not the right agency, because if that's not the right agency, then the DOJ will forward the complaint to the right entity. So DOJ was tapped with the enforcement of the ADA, and then they tapped other agencies like Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to enforce the employment piece. So DOJ might say, I'm interested in that case, we're going to take it, or they might give it to EEOC.
Right, okay, I understand that. What about education, not education, but yeah, education.
Okay.
What do they have to follow as far as ADA rules and regulations?
So are you talking K to 12?
K through 12 was actually, where I was.
Where you were going. So the Americans with Disabilities Act certainly applies to K through 12, but you also have IDEA and Section 504.
Right.
So if someone has an IEP plan, then they should pursue their rights through that process first, I would say, because the ADA allows for reasonable modifications. So if you need technology in order to access the curriculum, then yes, the ADA would apply. Or maybe a bus stop needs to be moved, then the ADA would apply. But IDEA allows for a change in the curriculum as well that the ADA doesn't require.
Okay, so you have to go through the educational system.
Well, there are all these laws that apply to everything, and education is the ideal, the culmination of, or is a good example of a culmination of a lot of laws, IDEA, 504, ADA, as well as state law. Especially here in Massachusetts, we had one of the first special education laws in the country.
Right.
So it's all of these laws that apply, and
It gets really confusing.
it gets really confusing. So yes, the ADA does apply,
Yeah.
and I am certainly happy to talk more about it, but I feel like I'm talking in circles, and I don't want to do that.
Okay. Most public entities have to comply with ADA rules and regulations for discrimination. Why are private clubs and religious organizations exempt from that?
Sure. Well, so religious education, religious entities, a separation of church and state. So the ADA doesn't apply, but state law still applies to religious entities. Private clubs aren't open to the public, so
I see.
so the ADA doesn't apply. But you can't just say you're a private club and get that exemption. You have to truly be a private club. So courts have found that clubs are private if members membership is highly selective. There's a substantial membership fee. The entity is operated on a nonprofit basis, and they weren't founded to subvert the civil rights laws out there. Now, interestingly, if a facility rents out space, say for weddings, to the public, that part of the club has to comply with the ADA, so it would have to be accessible. Or bar mitzvahs. Some clubs are open in part to the public.
Right, to the public.
And if they are open to the public in any way, at least that part of the club needs to be accessible.
Oh, okay. Didn't know that. All right, for the purpose of Americans with Disabilities Act, is it to restrict or eliminate discrimination against individuals with disabilities? Do you feel this document is achieving this?
It's a work in progress. The ADA was written by people, interpreted by people, and enforced by people. So, you know, it's not a perfect document, but hopefully we'll get there, and it is a work in progress. That's why the New England ADA Center and the other 9 ADA centers were created to help implement the ADA and ultimately make sure that people with disabilities were included.
Now, what do you feel about it?
What do I feel like? I feel that it's an imperfect document, but it's a work in progress.
Okay. So what other entities do we have with the ADA? What else do they cover?
What do you
As
mean?
far as subject matter, they cover education. They cover transportation.
Yep.
They cover employment. Is there another area that they cover?
Well, so we look at it, well, the way I explain it, they certainly cover employment. That's Title I. So if a person with a disability needs reasonable accommodations in order to do the job, that's Title I. Title II, state and local government. So towns do a lot for their community members. All of those programs need to be accessible, whether it's accessing your birth certificate or the dog park or recreation or the senior center. So anything you can think of that the town does, that needs to be accessible to people with disabilities. And then Title III, private businesses or nonprofits need to be accessible to people with disabilities. So your grocery stores, your McDonald's, your Walmart, your Targets, your supermarkets, your movie theaters, your malls, all of those, your fast food. So the ADA covers a lot.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Now, something that people get confused about is housing. The ADA is not
Right.
usually involved in housing, only in a small area, public housing, group homes, recovery homes. The ADA would apply to those types of housing, but we had the Fair Housing Act. So the ADA said, that's already covered. We don't need to cover housing except
Right.
for these areas.
Do they get specific? I've heard that they get specific about like the size of or the height of the toilet and that type of stuff.
They do.
They do. They get that specific.
For some things. So they do get, and the distance from the wall. So physical access was first, the first research was done because of veterans coming back from World War II.
I see.
And so it was really veterans and seniors who are pushing physical access forward.
Okay. Well, I thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you for having me.
And hopefully, maybe you would like to come on the show again to cover more information about this.
I would be happy to come back. And certainly people are welcome to call the New England ADA Center and me if they have any further questions.
Okay, and that will be found in our credits. Okay, the Americans with Disabilities Act is an extensive document addressing many subjects we haven't yet discussed. Individuals with disabilities and their caretakers should make an effort to familiarize with its contents in case you believe you've been discriminated against. Till next time on Your Disability Connection.